pleasure and honor to welcome everybody, the guests and the nice audience in the roundtable today. The topic is facets of populism, varieties of trump cards. The name was invented by Piotr Sula, so I don't take any responsibility for the topic in a way. And of course, first, let me briefly introduce the panelists that we are so happy to host, and we are honored to host them in Wrocław today. Let's start with maybe Sofia. Sofia Vasilopoulou is a senior lecturer at the Department of Politics, University of York. Her research centers around the themes of Euroscepticism, political extremism, and loss of faith in traditional institutional politics and democracy. I think that we will touch on those topics during our discussion as well. One of her latest research ventures was ESRC Future Leaders Project, entitled Euroscepticism: Dimensions, Causes and Consequences in Times of Crisis. She is the author, among many other publications, of the book Far-Right Parties and Euroscepticism Patterns of Opposition. Dr. Lenka Bustikova-Syrocki is an associate professor in the School of Politics and Global Studies at Arizona State University. Her research focuses on party politics, voting behavior, clientelism, and state capacity, with special reference to Eastern Europe. She's the double recipient of Best Article Prize, awarded by the American Political Science Association in 2015 for her article Revenge of the Radical Right. It was European Politics and Society section, and in 2017 for her article Patronage, Trust and State Capacity, the historical trajectories of clientelism. And it was the comparative democratization section. Her book, which I strongly recommend, Extreme Reactions, Radical Right Mobilization in Eastern Europe, is forthcoming with Cambridge University Press. Alex Szczerbiak, which is well known in Poland, is a professor of politics and contemporary European studies and director of doctoral studies for law, politics and sociology at the University of Sussex. His research centers around comparative Central and East European politics, especially Poland, the impact of European integration on national politics, political parties, electoral politics, the politics of transitional justice, and religion and politics. He is the author of such books, among others, as Poland Within the European Union, New Awkward Partner, or New Heart of Europe, and politicizing the communist past, the politics of truth revelation in post-communist Poland. Now he's currently working on a project on the role of religion in post-communist Polish politics. Last but not least, welcome Professor Ireneusz Karolewski, who holds the Chair of Political Science at the Willy Brandt Center for German and European Studies in here University of Wrocław. His main areas of research are collective identity, citizenship, and nationalism. His more recent book publications include European Identity Revisited, Civic Resources and the Future of European Union, The Nation and Nationalism in Europe, and the Citizenship and Collective Identity in Europe. Let me tell you a few words about how we will proceed. Yes, so the debate will be as follows. We will have some opening statements from the participants, like 5 to 10 minutes, I think, and then immediately we will set up for questions and discussion with the audience. I expect lively, insightful, and maybe even contested debate, since, as I checked yesterday, over 50 panels in this conference deals directly with the problems of populism, far right, extreme right, not to mention individual presentations that are given during the conference. So there is a very high probability that the majority of the audience is already the experts on the topic. Yes, so we really can expect some insights and difficult questions. Also, this huge number of aforementioned panels definitely proves that the subject constitutes current or main preoccupation of the political life in Europe and political science researchers today. Hence, we are looking for causes, we are mapping various iteration of the current far-right and or populist tendencies. We are trying to establish some patterns, some models, and we are hoping to have some contribution in this type of debate. And we have some preoccupations, yes, because we had a small discussion that in reality, we don't want to explain some phenomena, especially of law and justice and Central and Eastern Europe, only in terms of populism. Yes, we believe that this term, especially when we think about it in this as an umbrella term, is not sufficient to explain what is happening in Poland, for example, nowadays. And another issue that I think that Ireneusz especially will tackle is when I took part in a few of the panels, I saw that usually we treat far-right parties and populist parties as the opposition or in contradictory terms to the mainstream parties. Yes, we see those competition. But what exactly happens when those anti-elitist parties or anti-mainstream parties become mainstream parties, become political elites in the country? What happens when their propositions or policies are taken over by the mainstream as mainstream populist? Everyone is populist in this regard. So these are my questions, yes, my hesitation regarding the subject. Of course, when we talk about the main typical countries that come to mind are Poland and Hungary. Yes, that's why we will discuss in detail the issue of Law and Justice Party. It will be done by Alex. We will talk about its distinguishing features, what are the reasons of its electoral success, and Alex will also try to find to what extent those factors explaining Polish case are unique, or can we or maybe can we draw some more comparative lessons? Yeah? And I think that those questions are also will be picked up by Lenka and Sofia in this regard. But Sofia will focus more about the question of satisfaction of or dissatisfaction with the governance. Yes. In European Union, and Lenka will mostly say about the problem of volatility of radical right in the political scene, and also in terms of its reaction to the ascendance of the minorities in political system. We agree that Lenka will start. Yes. So I turn the microphone to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a great honor to join this formidable panel. Thank you for the invitation. It's nice being here in Wroclaw. I will also talk about make four remarks or make a brief opening statement. The first point I want to make is has to do with something what I would call populism with adjectives and the fact that we live in this era of proliferation of populism. The second is I would like to, this is something that we discussed at the lunch, I would like us to think about the relationship between anti-establishment and the fact that many of the populists are in power, so how can we can call them populists if they hold the office keys. The third point I want to talk about is volatility, and I will draw on my forthcoming book mostly. And finally, I would like to make a controversial point, which is to say that I think radical right parties are not dangerous democracy. It's the mainstream parties, or radicalized mainstream parties, and the mainstream parties have the responsibility to step it up, and they are the true guardians of democracy. Although the problem is really the mainstream, not the radical right. I think we live in the era of populist infestation. We all are uncomfortable with the concept. It's something that came up during the lunch. And I think sometimes older and more narrow concepts are more useful. Sometimes, if you study, I study a lot of nationalist parties, they don't always need to be populist. And I think sometimes nationalism is really their core ideology, and there is no need really to proliferate the adjectives and sort of expand the definition of the animal that I'm trying to understand. Populism is an ideology that cohabitates with many other thicker ideologies. For example, in my work with Petra Kvasty, who sits here in the first floor, we try to understand democratic backsliding in the Czech Republic, so we work with this animal, technocratic populism. So we also contribute to this proliferation of populisms, or populisms with adjectives or nouns in this case. And so we sort of think this is an animal that combines an ideology of technocratic efficiency with a populist appeal. So I think we should honor the fact that we live, especially I think in Eastern European scholarship, we live in the era of proliferation of types. We should be happy about it because it's exciting. But sometimes we should also keep in mind that there are some old, well-tested concepts that will do just fine, and we don't have to dump populism on anything we see. Number two, and again, the panelists will touch on this as well. When you think about Orban or Trump, you think, what the hell is so anti-establishment about it? You're talking about people who hold power. And if you believe that anti-establishment ideologies, or anti-establishment sentiments are part of populist ideology, then it's a stretch to call these people populist. So that's one point I want to make. So how do we go about it? And I know other panelists will say more about this. Number two is that do we believe what the so-called populists or populists say, or what they do? So, for example, if Donald Trump modifies the tax code that really benefits the rich, do we still call him a populist? Or should we look at his actions and his policies and really call him for who he is? And the same goes for Orban. He can say things, and then he tries to modify the labor law that will benefit large international corporations that need cheap East European labor. Do we call him populist, or do we look at the policies that are really in place? Number three, and I'm here drawing on my book, and thank you very much for the promotion, it's very kind. In my own work, I study, so the book is about the radical right in Eastern Europe, and one thing that I really try to do in the book is to focus on the volatility of the support. So, my suggestion would be, let's not just look at the headlines, but look at the volatility. The vote shares for radical right parties fluctuate a lot, and I think that that's a real puzzle, why we see these surges that go up and down. And so we need theories that can capture this volatility. So in my particular work, I think the answer to the volatility is a dynamic of accommodation of minorities, and sort of the main argument of the book is that the acquisition of political power and demand for rights by ascendant minority groups precipitate backlash on mobilization of the radical right. So that means that if the accommodation increases and the voting for the right surges, there is a sort of follow-up in the sense that if the accommodation recedes, then the far right should recede as well. So the far right vote shares are, or anyone who is in power, are in precarious positions of power. And the same goes for populists. Donald Trump will, I think, lose the election. So we need to take volatility seriously and understand why they go up, but also why they go down, or why they never emerge. And my final very brief point is that radical right parties are not dangerous to democracy in the sense that they rarely hold major keys to power. All the backsliding that we are seeing in Eastern Europe is from parties that were originally mainstream, and they radicalized over time. So it's not that the extreme is coming in and hijacking the political system. It's the main, something happened to the mainstream. It moved and it radicalized. And so we should also, I think demand, and that, speaking at the European level, that mainstream parties step up the game, assume responsibility as guardians of democratic order before it's too late, and in some cases it's probably too late. Okay. Thank you.
Because I don't have the microphone.
Thank you very much, Lenka, for this very interesting introductory points. I'm just going to move on to something related, but not exactly what Lenka was talking about, which is kind of the age-old question of what may help us understand and explain the rise of the far right across Europe. So I've been working on this subject for quite a while already, and the key debate in the literature is it a cultural question? So is the far right successful because they do draw upon this politics of identity and value-driven grievances which are exacerbated by globalization? Or is it, on the other hand, a question of economic grievances? So people who have been crowded out, let's say, from the jobs and so on, again due to globalization, vote for the far right because of economic related reasons. So my argument is that this debate relies on a few assumptions that are not necessarily the right assumptions. First, this clear-cut distinction between economy on the one hand and identity on the other hand does not take into account that the translation of salient issues among the voters takes place within a framework or a context that the state and political institutions play a very important role in translating these issues into policy. So I think the debate is missing this idea of the state and institutions being crucial to understanding policy. The second assumption is that immigration is primarily a cultural type of issue. That being said, immigration cuts across a number of different policy areas. Of course, it has an identity component, but it also has a component that relates to the economy, a component that relates to safety, terrorism, law and order, crime, and crucially, a component that relates to welfare. So, which brings me to my third point, which is that if issues are multidimensional, as I'm trying to argue, then different sets of individuals, different groups of individuals will be drawn to the far right by different concerns, and not necessarily a straight up and down type of identity type of concern. And my argument is here that we need to take into consideration that the role of institutions and the role that the state has as a broader framework of collective collaboration in which institutional trust, compensation, and national solidarity are dimensions of good governance. So simply put, my idea is that actually good governance plays a very important role in deterring a number of people from voting for the far right. And I've tested this idea using individual level voter data from the European Social Survey over time and across all European countries, and essentially the finding is key. So when individuals have positive perceptions of what I call the social contract, this idea of state capacity, so high levels of trust in institutions, satisfaction with the economy, but crucially also satisfaction with the state of social services such as health, education, and so on, then the likelihood to opt for the far right is much, much lower. And I think that's one of the key points I wanted to make today, that governance matters. But of course, immigration is a key issue that relates to voting for the far right, and we should not turn a blind eye to that. But essentially, what we find is that when perceptions of the social contract and state capacity and institutions are negative, so people have low trust in institutions, they have a negative perception of social services, education, health, and so on, they are equally likely to opt for the far right, regardless on what they feel about immigration. So that's quite important, because this is how the far right is able to mobilize voters across a number of attitudinal groups and not only draw voters from the classic sort of voter type or voter group, which is the anti-immigrant population. So why does this all matter? I think it matters because And kind of drawing a little bit on what Lenka has already said, is that if institutions matter, then the solution, or part of the solution of addressing the far right, is not just immigration, right? And we know already from a number of scholars that work on this that when mainstream parties become more anti-immigrant, actually, if anything, they legitimize the role and the rhetoric of far-right parties. But institutions matter. So perhaps mainstream political parties should focus much more on governance rather than changing their position on immigration. The problem, though, is that it's a catch-22 situation, because what we find is that actually, if perceptions of the social contract improve, then that means that people who are in favor of immigration are less likely to vote for the far right. Okay? So that is what we expect anyway. However, we find that people who are anti-immigrant, as their perception of state capacity improve, they are more likely, even more likely to opt for the far right, which is perhaps because they want to keep those goods to the in-group. So it is a bit of a catch-22 situation, and I think I would like to close with that and invite your comments on this idea. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much for inviting me to this panel. I'm a UK-based academic, so it's obligatory for me to begin with some kind of an apology. And my apology is that I'm a bit of an imposter here, because I don't research radical rights, I don't research populism, I don't engage with any of these concepts, although perhaps I'm not as unusual as I thought I was. I'm really a specialist in post-communist Polish politics, and some people say I don't do that very well either. So what I'm going to talk about is about the Law and Justice Party. But I'm a comparative political scientist, and I'm interested in the post-communist states more broadly. So what I'm going to try and do is I'm going to try and look at the reasons why the Law and Justice Party has been so popular and continued to be so popular, and then try to reflect comparatively to what extent we can draw broader lessons from this, or to what extent are we really just talking about a uniquely Polish phenomenon. I mean, one of the reasons why Law and Justice has done so well, I suppose I should start with this, is a lot of people say it's because the opposition is very weak. And undoubtedly the opposition has a huge problem in the sense of it doesn't seem to offer very much other than returning to the status quo ante, which people don't want. But actually, the opposition is a lot stronger than people think. And I should start by saying I'm explaining why the Law and Justice Party is popular, not why it's going to win the election. Okay, because it'll win the election in terms of it'll get the most seats. You can bet a lot of money on that. Whether it can get an outright majority or not, it's too close to call, as they say in America, because actually the balance of opinion is very evenly divided. And the opposition has a lot of assets. It still controls a lot of the cultural establishment, the media, and a lot of business elites are still supportive of the opposition. So it's actually much more interesting and much more open than a lot of people think. And although the opposition is quite weak, and that's one of the reasons why it's done so well, it's actually a lot stronger than people think, and the election is much more open. So why is Law and Justice continue to be so popular? Well, the single most important reason is because it's delivered on the main issue that most Poles care about, and that's socio-economic issues, and it's delivered on the high-profile social spending pledges, child benefits, minimum wages, raising the retirement age that it promised it would deliver on. Not all of them, but most of them. Okay? And that's the key reason more than anything else. It's delivered on those high-profile social spending pledges without breaking the budget, okay? Without threatening economic growth, without running a budget deficit, okay? At least in the short term. Okay? So that's the single most important reason. It's said this is why people voted for it more than anything else, and it's delivered on it, and that's why it's popular. Beyond that, and touching on the point that Sophia was making about identity issues, it's also very carefully targeted certain moral cultural issues. Okay? Initially, it was about migration, about the EU's compulsory migration quotas. It's about the question of Muslim migration, which was overwhelmingly opposed in Poland. More recently, it's the question of sexual minorities. Okay. It's very carefully picked these issues, and partly it's about firing up its base, okay, which is very important. It was one of the reasons why it did so well in the European Parliament elections it doesn't normally do well in. But it's actually broader than that. It's managed to frame these issues in a way that's actually drawn very widespread support. Both of these issues have been framed in a way that's meant it's on the right side of public opinion, both migration and on these issues, and this has also helped to mobilise support. A third reason is that it's very skillfully avoided the various pitfalls that any governing party has. It's very quickly dealt with scandals, but perhaps most importantly, it's kind of known when to compromise. Okay, it's rode back on. It's not compromised on things that it thinks are core to its programme, but it has retreated on issues where they don't think they're that important and they can make a retreat on it. Abortion, for example, another moral cultural issue which most law and justice leaders probably are very socially conservative about, but it's retreated on that. Or some of its legal reforms. Okay, it's made sure it's stuck to the ones that are the core to its judicial reform programme, while retreating on others that potentially bring it into conflict with the European Court of Justice. But perhaps most importantly, and I think this is often ignored, is because people, whatever misgivings they might have about law and justice, and people do, and a lot of individual reforms that it's introduced, people have been against or had serious misgivings about things like civil rights and democracy. It's been prepared to cut law and justice, or a lot of people have prepared to cut it a lot of slack. And there are a number of reasons. It's been willing to forgive it a lot of things. Okay? There are a number of reasons for this. Partly because there are a lot of people who just simply reject the narrative of the opposition. Okay? The media is very segmented in Poland, and it's very, very possible to just watch media that tells you the law and justice are a bunch of fascists, or just watch media that tells you the opposition are a bunch of traitors. Okay? So a lot of these things have simply been interpreted through people's narratives. But a lot of this is to do with the idea that the reason people like law and justice and are prepared to willing to forgive it, even if there are things that it doesn't necessarily entirely go along with, is because it's engaged in something that you might call the redistribution of prestige. Okay? It's a feeling that a lot of people whose views have been ignored, who've been ignored when economic policy has been made, have finally got a government that is listening to it and it is taking its interests first. Okay? And this is both economic interests, so a lot of the social spending is about, it's not simply about kind of throwing money at people and saying, right, we'll give you some money and you forget about the rule of law stuff. It's more about the fact that, finally there's been this transition and some people have done very well out of this and a lot of us have been left behind and haven't done very well. And you've finally got a government that is actually making sure that the fruits of the transition are being properly redistributed. Or is making sure that our concerns about moral cultural issues like migration or sexual minorities are not being dismissed. Okay, as a bunch of racists or homophobes or hicks or whatever. So this concept of the redistribution of prestige, okay, I think is really important. And partly just getting credit for trying. Okay, so the details of the judicial reforms, a lot of these people are very uncomfortable with or don't like, but people know there's something wrong with the way the judiciary works in Poland. They know it needs to be reformed, and at least these people, or so this is how it's felt, are trying to do something about it. Okay, rather than just ignoring it. Okay, so what are the implications of this beyond Poland? Well, some of these things are obviously, they're very specific things to Poland. I mean, kind of skillful party management. Some of the issues that it's focused on. I mean, obviously, certain moral cultural issues are more important in some countries than others. These are obviously very, the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transsexual issue. It obviously, doesn't play out in some countries more than others. But I think there are some things that you know, we can draw lessons from. A key one, I think, is this, again, it comes back to what Sophia was saying, this combination of appealing to people who want leftist, solidaristic economic policies, but are also socially conservative. Okay? This is the winning formula, really, you know, for a right-wing party like Law and Justice. Okay? That kind of integral, you know, traditional American Republican, if you like, British conservative, social conservatism and economic liberalism is not the winner. Okay? It's got to be, if you want to sell social conservatism, okay, your constituency for this also wants leftist, solidaristic economic policies. And that's what Law and Justice has got right. Okay? And that's what, you know, the successful parties of this ilk have to combine those two elements. Okay. This is the second broader implication, this is a problem for the left, of course. It's a problem for that because, of course, the left is trying to build an alliance of economic, of people who want interventionist economic policies and are socially liberal. Okay. And this is a problem, okay, for the left because you've got a party that comes along and essentially takes that constituency, which wants nothing to do with social liberalism. And it's a real dilemma how to respond to this from the left. There's some interesting examples in post-communist states of how they've tried to respond to this. Look at parties like Fico's party, SME, in Slovakia. Look at the kind of appeal that Zeman wants in the Czech Republic. Okay, it's something that in Britain is called blue labour. Okay, it's trying to combine that kind of social conservatism, traditional working class social conservatism, with economic intervention. Okay, to be like Sweden, except how Sweden was in the 1960s, before the sexual revolution and before multiculturalism. I think the third lesson, or the third broader point, is that it's about prestige and not just cash. Okay, it's about a group of people who think that their prestige hasn't sufficiently been recognised, okay, by ruling elites. Okay, and that's both in terms of cash, because they've, you know, kind of hoarded this money for themselves. Okay, they've benefited from it. It's not drifted out, but also in terms of attitudes that they dismiss and don't look down upon us. Okay, and I think this is key. It's a combat to say it's just about money. It's just about, you know, throwing money at these people, or it's just about migration or whatever. It's much more subtle than that, and a lot of this is about prestige. It's about not dismissing people, but engaging with them. And finally, I think that another comparative lesson is there's a particular dimension to this in post-communist states, which is about the transition. Okay. I mean, in Western countries, people talk about the winners, losers of globalization. But in post-communist states, it's about the winners and losers, if you like, of transition. I'm always worried about using the word losers. I always think Donald Trump sending a tweet with the word losers in capital letters. You know, these people don't care about losers. But it's people who feel that they've been excluded from those benefits, and don't feel that they've shared in the fruits of the transition. I think that's something particularly in post-communist states, which goes beyond this kind of, you know, globalization, the anywhere, somewhere dichotomy that's sometimes posed. It's about whether you think that you've benefited sufficiently from the economic transition. And parties like Law and Justice talk to those people, okay, and no doubt similar parties in other post-communist states, and, you know, and say, you know, we are the first party that's actually taking an interest in those people who have not done so well out of the transition, who've been ignored up until now, either in terms of what they believe, their views, their values, or in terms of economy. Okay.
Thank you very much. I'm going to focus on a couple of ideas that are fleshed out in an article to be published, hopefully to be published, in Eastern European politics on what happens when populists come to power. And a colleague of mine from Budapest, Roberta, and myself We're trying to understand the processes that took place in Poland and Hungary in recent 10 years. And we are trying to argue that the more interesting issue about populism or adjacent phenomena is not what the populists say, but what they do, which connects quite well with what Lenka said. So our point of departure is an article that Gabriel Almond wrote a couple of years ago, actually a couple of decades ago, in the 1950s, 56, in his seminal work on comparative political systems, where he used the term Caesaristic breakthrough. Right? He argued that in the 1950s, in his comparison of political systems, some political systems, democratic political systems, tend to break down, to assume Caesaristic forms, which is non-democratic forms. He even spoke about totalitarianism. We don't go that far, but we fancy the idea of Caesaristic breakthroughs and argue that such a Caesaristic breakthrough took place in Hungary and Poland in 2010, in Hungary, and later on in 2015, in Hungary and in Poland. And we try to argue that, we try to approach this issue of Caesaristic breakthrough by arguing that there are three elements of what we call Caesaristic politics. So it's an attempt to be more precise about populism, to be precise about the authoritarian term in both countries by using the term Caesaristic or Caesarian politics, if you like. And in this article, we argued that there are three aspects of Caesarian politics in both countries. The first aspect is the patronage politics that we can also find in other countries. This is the term that we borrowed from Henry Haley from his analysis of Russian politics, actually. The second aspect is the party-state capture that also can take place in other countries. That is quite visible and has been quite visible in both countries, in Hungary and Poland, also in other countries. And the third aspect is the exclusionary identity politics. And by using these three aspects, we try to map out the processes of change that took place in Hungary and Poland. So turning to these three aspects, beginning with the first aspect of patronage politics that have been well described in literature on Russia and Ukraine, we argue that similar processes took place in Hungary and Poland, and it's about patron-client networks of informal understandings that reformulate the decision-making processes in both countries. And those patron-client networks are mainly about the access to the patron. There's one figure in the decision-making network. Sometimes there are two networks or more networks. And it's essential for political decision-makers to be granted this access to the patron, not just for the political career, but also for the personal enrichment. Right? At the same time, the patron-client networks work as a way to close the system politically. It's a political closure, because the goal of those networks is to limit political competition. So it's not just a political dominance of one party, it also processes changes that have structural consequences with the ultimate goal of limiting political competition. And of course there are differences, as we argue in the paper, between Hungary and Poland. This could be due to the length of these processes that took place or began in Hungary quite early, because already in 2010 and only in 2015 in Poland. But there are similarities, and if we look for differences, we pose this idea, the concept that there might be still differences between the networks, since Hungary is more typical for what Henry Haley described with regard to Russia, a single pyramid system of networks, whereas Poland is more a competing pyramid system with competing networks. The second aspect of Caesarian politics is party-state capture, also well described in the literature. There's literature on how different state capture has happened in the region in Central and Eastern Europe, the corporate state capture, being quite typical for the Czech Republic and Slovakia, and the party-state capture for Poland and Hungary. And the idea behind that is, of course, that it's not only about the exchange of personnel, meaning the people in the ministries, in the public government sector, but it's not only about state-owned companies. It's a very, it's also takeover of supposedly independent institutions such as courts. And we argue in the article that the main thrust of reforms, of changes, institutional changes in both countries were courts, independent courts, and this is not a coincidence, because this follows the logic of Caesarean politics, because it leads to dismantling of the law and establishment of rule by law, actually, which again limits the political competition. The third aspect of it, the exclusionary identity politics, is also quite typical for many countries with populist actors, where quite similar narratives are shared. The deep state conspiracy narratives are shared not only by Poland and Hungary, but of course, as you know, by many other countries like the US. Similar tropes are used to polarize the public sphere, and on the one hand to mobilize the electorate of the parties in power, but also, of course, to limit political competition. So in a sense, all three elements function as mechanisms for reduction of political competition. And the question, of course, as it poses itself, is what does it amount to, right? What do we have at the end of those processes? So what does Caesarean politics amount to is, at the end, eventually a certain form of authoritarianism. It's populist in the sense that it seeks majoritarian support. The question is if it's democratic support, it's majoritarian support. And it poses challenge to democracy, at least to democracy between elections, right? And this is one of the main differences between straight authoritarian systems, if you like, and Caesarean politics. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for that. And now we will move immediately to the questions from the audience. And if it's possible, we would like to take them in clusters. Maybe it will make the discussions more swiftly. Okay, who wants to start?
Hello, thank you very much for this roundtable. I have a question for Sophia. I was just wondering whether you have checked for differences in people's opinions based on sex when you were talking about your findings, whether women and men differ in their approaches towards the far right based on sex. Thank you.
Okay, there is no other question.
There was someone else, yeah.
Is there someone
Yeah,
else?
there was someone.
Okay.
Over there.
Okay, I'm right.
And there was
Thanks a lot for the interesting perspectives on mainly the Eastern European phenomenon of populism or far-right parties. I'm Rainer Kutzer from ISS Potsdam, and I know I'm not familiar with Eastern European politics, but a little bit with Italian politics. And I was wondering if you could maybe comment on the populist phenomenon there, where we have obviously the Lega, which is the kind of equivalent to some of the far-right parties that you were probably referring to. But you also have the Five-Star Movement, which arguably is actually contesting more or less, if you want, a broken system, and maybe taking this discussion from the perspective that some of these populist parties, at least in Italy, are partly sort of addressing very deep problems of the systems, and that need to be actually changed, and that require some kind of social movement type and popular movements to actually deal with them, and if that is an element also in the Eastern European context.
Thank you. 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 Thank
So thanks for the contribution. I have a question on the Caesarean politics idea and what has been put forward. So how do we explain that idea of patronage, state capture, and identitarian politics are all underlying conditions to distort every regime, every moment? The question is why at this exact moment did it happen? Why there was an enthusiasm towards democratization, particularly towards pioneering countries like Poland and Hungary, and what has changed in those parties, basically in terms of leadership, ideas, etc. So how did this happen? Given that patronage, I think, was always there, at least in the Hungarian case, there was always a left and a right division when it comes to corporate patronage, when it comes to the enterprises that were linked to the parties. So I myself am researching on that, and that's why I would like to understand better what the views are on patronage.
Hi, thank you. Really nice presentations. I have a question for Alex. Yeah, since we are now in Poland, yes, law and justice party is really strong, and there has been extensive mobilization of regressive forces in Polish politics and Polish society, and rather successful. My question actually relates to the opposite side. You said I think in brackets, something in between the lines, like the opposition is actually rather strong in Poland. So what I'm interested in hearing about are examples of progressive forces, that kind of progressive mobilization in Poland today. Thank you.
Okay, maybe we'll move to answers, okay? Who wants to start?
Well, I guess mine is quite straightforward. I think the general tendency is that men are more likely to opt for the far right in general, and in my models using the European social survey, this is a consistent positive effect of men being more likely to opt for the far right from the data from 2002 onwards across countries. That being said, with the far right becoming increasingly more successful, I think the gap between male and female is becoming more narrow.
Yeah, I think the point about Italy, I mean, these are parties that are addressing genuine grievances. I think that sort of ties in with the point I was making about why law and justice is why people are prepared to cut it a lot of slack. I mean, for example, a lot of criticisms that are made of the judicial reforms in Poland seem to operate on the assumption that basically people thought the judiciary was operated okay until law and justice came along and suddenly politicised it. And I think, even if you don't agree, and opinion polls show that a lot of polls are very uncomfortable about specific judicial reforms that are introduced, there are huge, huge concerns about the way that the judiciary operates in Poland. So I think, as I say, I think there are a lot of parallels here. And even if, some of the things that are being proposed are kind of a bit messy, really, in a sense, people are prepared to tolerate, or a lot of people, obviously not everyone, but a lot of people are prepared to tolerate that, if at least somebody is trying to sort out these mythologies. So I think there's some parallels here. So the question about state capture, well, this is an interesting one because actually, when I hear the process of state capture being described, it sounds to me like post-communism, really. The colonization of the state appointments to it, certainly in Poland, that's what characterizes post-communism, patronage is kind of always there. Law and Justice's argument is that at least we're being kind of honest about this. You know, that a lot of these institutions that you are saying operated independently or were appointed on merit or, you know, were through competition in the case of the civil service, or actually have always been politicised. Okay, right from the word go. You know, that they represent a set of elite interests and you know, appointments to a lot of these kind of state bodies. And all we're doing is we're saying we're being honest about it. Now, you know, you can buy that explanation, or you can say, you know, it's a load of rubbish and they shouldn't be doing this. But I think at the nub of it is a point that actually, again, it's about this thing about, you know, trying to simply being seen to return to the status quo ante. Well, actually, the status quo ante contains a lot of pathologies, and simply kind of mobilising around that, which is what the opposition has tried to do, as you know, kind of hit a brick wall, really, and comes across as being extremely complacent. So I think that's my problem. I mean, obviously, you know, you can talk about whether the degree of what's going on, in quantitative, qualitative terms is different. That's fine. But to pretend that under post-communism, you know, you don't, for example, have state patronage. Okay, and it only happens when you get parties like Law and Justice coming in, is just not true, in my view. And to pretend it's true is actually a mistake by the opponents of Law and Justice, because, as I say, it makes you look like you're defending the status quo ante, which people don't approve of. However, and this comes back to the point about the opposition, it is stronger than you might imagine. Public support, if you aggregate the vote that's received by opposition parties and the votes that's received by Law and Justice, you'll actually find that, you know, these are two pretty evenly divided camps. And whether or not Law and Justice ends up with a majority after the election is going to depend on very small numbers of people, either, you know, voting for Law and Justice 1 or 2% more that pushes it over, or whether one of the smaller opposition parties falls below the 5% electoral threshold. So, you know, it's kind of really about that. And Law and Justice will find it very, very difficult to form a government if it doesn't have a majority. Okay. They're also, you know, looking out beyond these kind of political resources. There's lots of other resources. I mean, coming back to this point about, you know, how can you be anti-establishment when you're in government? Well, one of the arguments that you know, something like Law and Justice would use is, well, the cultural elites, for example, are overwhelmingly controlled by the liberal, okay, by our opposition forces. There's a lot of attention focused on the fact that Polish state media is, as it said, a propaganda of Law and Justice. And if you watch the Polish TV news, it's not subtle. Okay? I watch it every day because I want to know what the government thinks, but it's a bit like being whacked around the head by a rubber sock. But there are lots of other opposition outlets that are controlled by the opposition. It's a key difference, I think, with Hungary. Okay, this was, from what I know, I'm not a Hungarian specialist, from what I know, one of the key lessons that Orbán drew from his first term in office was that it doesn't matter if you control all these political institutions. If you're still being hammered by the media and the cultural elites, then, you know, you're going to be constantly on the back foot. And that's not really something that Law and Justice has got to grips with, the private media. Okay, and it's something that you know, it's very, very brittle, because if they lose power, suddenly they lose control of state broadcasting, they lose all the contracts from state-owned companies, which is keeping a lot of their publications and synthetic media outlets going. And finally, the Polish left, okay, which is in the electoral doldrums, okay, it's been in crisis for 15 years, has a much greater influence over public debate than its electoral numbers would suggest, because it is extremely well placed in cultural elites and extremely well connected with Western opinion-forming elites. So, in a sense, it's able to get its message across way above the kind of the political numbers that it might have. Okay. So, you know, it's in all those senses, even looking at the left, which is electorally very, very weak, in terms of its position within the cultural elite, it's very, very strong and therefore very influential in terms of the national elite.
Yeah, thank you for the questions. A couple of very interesting ones. I don't know much about Italy, so your question about Italy, I cannot answer this, but I can refer you to the paper by Almond, who argued in the 1950s. We have certain political systems that are prone to break down, right? And he clearly, he differentiated between continental and Anglo-Saxon systems, and he called clearly Italy and France to be the case for the first group. But because of specific structural features, these political systems tend to break down, meaning tend to be more populist, tend to be inefficient, tend to be unstable in democratic terms, as opposed to Anglo-Saxon political system, which we know it's not true. Meanwhile, but in the 1950s, 1960s, in the research on civic culture, it was a different view. Right? So the question would be, is there something structural about certain political systems, Poland and Hungary, for instance, Italy, France, maybe other countries, or is it something else? Right? The question about Caesarean politics is also a very good one. Why did it happen now? Right? What is the cause of it? We don't know exactly. Right? So it's an excellent question, and there are possible answers to that. One of the possible answers is that Hungary was first, and because of specific conditions in Hungary, economic recession and very low legitimacy of the previous government, it was able for the Fidesz government for the Fidesz as a party to have a government with the support of constitutional majority, which allowed the changes to be made. And Poland is basically, what Poland is doing is policy imitation. Right? So this is a very successful example of how to introduce illiberal politics or Caesarean politics, and because you have the roadmap in front of you, because it was tested already, it was successfully tested, because you can argue Fidesz won electoral majority, constitutional majority twice. The Poles don't need to invent anything else, they just have it in front of them. There are also other explanations. One of the possible explanation is that these countries are very similar concerning the transformation paths. I mentioned that there is this, in literature you have this categorization of corporate state capture and party state capture, that perhaps similarities between Poland and Hungary are so striking that there is structural pressure to follow the same path, right? That's also a possible explanation, that the party state capture was, of course, there beforehand, and because it was practiced by other parties, by other governments, it is easy for the current government, for the PIS government, to pretend that this is actually politics as usual. With this argument that Alex mentioned, we are not doing anything else, we're basically doing the same thing that previous governments did, but they are actually doing something else. And my argument would be, it's not a difference of degree, it's a difference of kind. And with the state, specifically with reference to the party state capture, the key issue here is not that they replaced personnel in different institutions of the state or state-owned enterprises. The key issue are courts. That the courts are actually those institutions that are crucial for the survival of democracy whenever there are issues such as Caesaristic breakthrough, and that this issue is quite different from what has been going on in those countries concerning state capture under previous governments. So there is, I think, or at least we argue this in the paper, that this is a difference of kind rather than difference of degree.
So I just want to make a brief remark on the positive change that the populists will bring. I would not hold my breath, that's not going to happen in my view. That doesn't mean that populism is not very skillful in combining different types of grievances. So economic grievances are, perfect fuel. Of course, in Eastern Europe, this was what Alex mentioned. Corruption is a very potent mobilizing tools. But then you have to think about this distinction between populism as an ideology and strategy. So Kurt Weiland sort of used populism as a strategy. And then, in my view, all of this is really used to, use these sort of powerful grievances to bypass, to come up with sort of new institutional solutions that bypass representative democracy. Because populism is about a direct contact, and so this is just a strategic use of very, very legitimate grievances, but ultimately, I think this is just smoke and mirrors.
Populism, and it's quite clear that in countries such as Poland, Hungary, Italy, and a couple of others, this cooperation between ultra-conservative civil society actors and religious actors and right-wing populists has had a great impact on the discourses, on the type of populist discourses in the sense of who is the enemy and who are we, in the ways in which the religious affiliations are used politically, and the church plays a role as a political institution. So I would be very happy if you could say something about this aspect as well.
So if I can just plug our panel, because we organized some section on extremism and democracy. We have a panel on civil society where some of these theoretic connections are going to be discussed. And I think you're right. I mean, as I said, in my view, I have a very cynical view of the use of the populist politics. You use the help of the societal groups that you can, that are available in the menu, and we see the politicization of Catholic Church and other churches in Eastern Europe as well. And I also would like to draw attention to a great Netflix show, which is called The Family, which is about the influence of Christian churches on U.S. politics. But what's sort of relevant in this Netflix show, it shows how cross-national some of these networks are, and that even some foreign religious groups, not just Christian, but other certainly religious groups have stakes in some of these debates in Eastern Europe. So if you look at anti-abortion referenda, this is, a lot of it is grassroots, but you do see influence from abroad, both from Russia, but from some Christian conservatives from the United States as well. And I should also mention that I'm a big believer in conspiracy theory, so hence the show.
Yes, thanks for bringing that up. I don't particularly work on this specific aspect of the far right, but it's kind of a fun fact about Greek politics, which is not necessarily the same as Eastern Europe, because obviously it's, the Greek Orthodox Church is quite powerful in Greece, and what you saw when the Golden Dawn was on the rise is that actually aspects of the program of the Golden Dawn were very similar to what the church wants, right? The questions of abortion, gay rights, and so on, they actually stand on the same position. And there was this theatrical show in Athens in 2012 called Corpus Christi. So it's a show that presents that Jesus was gay, and there's a whole sort of story around that. And what was very interesting is that you saw members of the Golden Dawn and Golden Dawn politicians outside the theatre campaigning and protesting against the show, and next to them there were priests. And it was very interesting how actually the extent to which that the program of the church and the Golden Dawn was quite aligned, and this was just an example. But more deeply, we saw in Greece quite a lot of support by priests for the party, and even public support in terms of public statements, for instance. But also, there were quite a lot of sort of anecdotal stories about priests talking in church in support of the party. So I think that's a long way of saying that this is not an Eastern European phenomenon. Also, we can see it in other European countries too.
And in Africa, actually, too.
Sorry?
Yeah, in Africa.
And in Africa as well, yeah.
Just to follow.
Yeah, so I mean, there's people who've researched this question and written books about it and can comment on it much better. But I'm quite interested in it because I'm actually starting to look at mobilisation around the religious and secular divide. And I think I'll make 3 points. I mean, I think the first one is it's important to differentiate between the base and broad support. Okay, so even in a country which isn't particularly religious, okay, for a social conservative party, a party that has social conservatism as part of its appeal, mobilising the base can have a religious, the religious right, if you like, can be an important element of the base, and even if not electorally, in terms of activists and people who join. Now, obviously, in terms of Western secular countries, you're not going to mobilise an election-winning issue around a religious appeal. It's simply not going to work like that. In those countries, social conservatives have to concentrate on different issues like multiculturalism, immigration, things like that. It's mobilising around kind of those kind of moral cultural issues, the cultural revolution in terms of attitudes towards sexual minorities. It's not going to work, but it can be quite significant in terms of mobilising an activist base and a core electorate. So obviously in different countries this works in different ways. Now, in a country like Poland, where we are at the moment, there's much more scope for this, okay, because it's a much more religious country. But even somewhere like Poland, you have to be kind of careful, really, if you're the Law and Justice Party, and it is, okay, and it is because, although it's a very religious country, Poland, 50% of people go to church once a week, there's also very great hostility to the church becoming involved in political affairs too much. Okay, and it's potentially something that anti-clerical forces can mobilise around as well. So, you've got to kind of play this, and Law and Justice is very clever, it's very strategic in the way it plays this. I was talking about issues that it kind of retreated on, which were not core to its programme. A good example of this was abortion. And this is one where, it actually comes into conflict with the Catholic Church. It was following the agenda of the Catholic Church through systematically. It would have pushed that through systematically. But it's not a core issue. We're going to come back on it. We're not a clerical religious party as such. We want to mobilise around Christian values, but we're not just going to take the church's agenda if it's going to damage us. Finally, I think the thing about Poland is that the key thing about Poland is that even for a lot of secular people, there is an intertwining of religious and national symbols. Okay, which means that people in Poland, specifically Poland, I don't know if it's what it's like this in other countries, are very defensive about profanities on religious symbols, even people who aren't necessarily that religious, okay, because they see this as a profanity on national symbols. A lot of religious symbols, the Black Madonna of Częstochowa, it's a famous religious icon, is a national symbol for Poland, not just a religious symbol. And therefore, to profane it actually ends up annoying a lot of people who aren't necessarily religious, especially religious. So I think, it varies from country to country, and not even necessarily whether it's a religious country. The extent to which, religiosity and national identity intertwine, I think, can also be important.
Just one comment, because we're moving from populism to nationalism, and this is also a possibility to analyze both in Hungary, but of course other countries. Of course, just to comment on what Alex said, is that this fusion between of nationalism and religion is quite typical for many other countries, not just Poland. It has become more popular, I think, in other countries because it has been apparently functionally efficient to use this fusion of ethno-religion. It has become more popular as a technology of power in Russia, of course, with the rise of the Orthodox Church and its embracement by the Kremlin. It has been quite typical for Croatia and its mixture of nationalism in the Catholic Church and so on. So as a technology of power, it seems to be also, in the case of Poland, less so, I think, in Hungary, a very effective tool of power exercise.
We have have like 10 minutes, so there's time for 2 or 3 questions maybe. Anyone?
Thank you for interesting presentations. I have a question to Alex and his remarks with regards to the Justice Party. It's a common question. Do you agree that it's not only what the Justice Party delivered with respect to social benefits and moral issues, things like that, but it's how they did it, and that how is linked with something very unusual, unique into the political world, which is the effective political leadership. Maybe one could argue maybe transformational leadership based on high ethical values.
Are there any others?
Over there.
Oh, there.
On the left.
Thank you. I think in each country in Europe there is a definition, or the same saying, if you hear a bad message, you kill the messenger, because you don't want to hear bad news. And I've got the feeling it's what's happening in the EU at the moment with liberal democracy. And there is only one person who could say it openly. The main trend, that's Vladimir Putin, who said that illiberal democracy is over because it doesn't suit citizen needs anymore. And I think you are looking for factors of explanation of the rise of illiberal democracy, but is it to be found probably in the change of the international system? When you have a great power, rivalry, emerging in a multipolar system, because the unipolar system doesn't work anymore, and liberal policies have led to fragmentation of nations because of ultraliberalism, mass immigration, Islamization, terrorism. It means illiberal state now is considered by citizens as the best way to protect their own security and keep the nation. So, but in Europe, it's impossible to say it openly because the people in power are defending the liberal system and label the people who promote illiberal state as fascist, Putinist trolls, or Russian trolls. But I think there is a lot of propaganda also from both sides about it, and I think it's related to the change of international system, a multipolar world, where the unipolar world, the westernization of the world, according to the American Anglo-Saxon liberal democracy, which is characterized by open borders, like Soros is promoting finance, free trade, mass immigration, leads to fragmentation of the nation, so it's a normal reaction of the people. What do you think?
I was thinking about the idea of how it's not necessarily about the extreme parties, but essentially about the mainstream parties that turn into being extreme in the meantime. And how would you then explain such a transformation through the lens of differentiating populism as ideology from populism as structure?
Ideology versus populism.
Okay, and we have to answer now. Who is that?
Okay, so I think the first question was specifically for me, so I'll answer that, and I'll comment a little bit on what the colleague there said. So, when you say it's not just what they delivered, but how they delivered, and I'm assuming by this you mean the personality and leadership of Jaroslaw Kaczynski. Well, try not to think about these things as a comparativist. I try and look at things that you can quantify and measure, and then carry across countries, and sort of leadership charisma. It's one of those things that's difficult to quantify and measure and draw sort of general lessons from. Leaders are charismatic until they lose an election, which will stop being charismatic very often. But I think the problem with that approach, if you do it too strictly, is you do miss something that's really important about the role of individuals and personalities. And I think, my answer to your question is yes. It's undoubtedly extremely important to law and justice, the success, the fact that the leadership of the Irish opportunity. It's very interesting because when Law and Justice was elected in 2015 and he stood back, he decided not to be, despite the fact he was party leader, he decided not to be the Prime Minister. People said this would be a recipe for chaos. You'd have rival power centres, you'd have an unaccountable power centre which nobody could bring to account before Parliament. I mean, the second argument is still used, but it's been incredibly functional, I think, for Law and Justice, having Jaroslav Kaczynski there, because he's acted as an unquestioned arbiter, which has kept a lot of factional disputes under wraps. It's meant, I said one of the reasons why Law and Justice has done well is because it's dealt with crises very well. It's meant because of his authority he's able to deal with those crises, and because he personally retains a lot of credibility, even among people who don't particularly like him, think he's honest, okay? And therefore, if he puts his foot down on something with a lot of kind of Law and Justice voters, he's their kind of personal guarantor that they will be kept clean. Okay, so he's very, very important in that sense, and also problematic because obviously he's not going to be around forever, and something will, and centrifugal tendencies are bound to set in with Law and Justice when he goes. I mean, I think the thing about liberal democracy is I'd make a couple of comments about this, particularly in the post-communist context. So what people like Law and Justice would say is the thing about this term liberal democracy is increasingly used as a way of taking the content out of political debate. It's taking issues which should be matters of political contestation and putting them above politics. Okay, it's a device. Okay, in order to do that, you make it something a right, and you make it a right that you can enforce through the courts. And these are courts, and to come back to the earlier point, which are colonised by the post-1989 establishment. These are elites that have their roots in the communist system and then have reproduced themselves, which is why their argument in favour of reform stems from. So it's a way of making sure that certain issues, regardless of whether you win or lose elections, are taken out of politics. And this produces frustration. And I think it produces a particular frustration in post-communist states. There's a really interesting article by Holmes and Krastek in the Journal of Democracy, I think it was written about a year ago, which talks about, these are obviously people who are quite sympathetic to liberal democracy, but it talks about the frustration of people in post-communist states at the constantly shifting, as they see it, definition of liberal democracy and what it entails, what kind of rights it entails. At the time they joined the EU, what they were signing up to in terms of what liberal democracy are seems to have moved on. For example, things like abortion, reproductive rights. Is this now a core element of liberal democracy? Legal recognition for same-sex partnerships. Is this a right? Okay, that is a core element of legal democracy. And their argument was, this isn't what we signed up to. When we joined the EU. These sort of fundamental European values, which are supposed to be the core of this thing called European democracy, keep being redefined all the time in a way that we can't keep up with, okay, and defines us as savages. And as a tool, essentially, this is how it's seen, for certain elites to take issues out of politics, okay, take issues out of democratic politics, so they never have to worry about losing elections.
I'll just make a brief point about this argument that, okay, well, all these problems are happening at the moment, there is this change in international order, therefore no wonder why we have rising levels of Euroscepticism, no wonder why we have all this backlash. And I personally have a problem with this argumentation for a number of reasons. First of all, these changes is not a new phenomenon, right? I'm not a historian, but if you ask a historian, they will tell you that globalization has been happening since empires dissolved, right? So it's definitely not a new phenomenon, right? And it's an ongoing process for the past centuries. That's one thing. Secondly, and related to that, I think it's about framing a change as a crisis. And that again is not a new thing, right? There are problems that are happening and developments that are happening in our societies over time. It's about political entrepreneurs framing those as crises. And the question of immigration has been politicized in the past in various European societies and outside Europe as well. I mean, the classic example is in the UK, Enoch Powell talking about rivers of blood through immigration, right? That's not a new thing. I think the key problem when it comes to Europe, because there was a question about the EU failure, and there are a number of things that are criticizable about the European Union, but I think one key issue that has come to light, especially with the crisis and as the European Union is getting more powers, is that there are conflicting majorities within the European Union. So my research has shown that, for example, different types of majorities prefer freedom of movement, for instance, right? So you have countries in Eastern Europe, for instance, or in Southern Europe that support freedom of movement, whereas citizens in Northern European countries do not support this. Vice versa, you have questions about European solidarity in terms of financial redistribution. Again, different types of majorities support these kinds of things. So I think this is the problem that the EU and the institutions, and not just the EU institutions, but also politicians in the member states are finding very hard to tackle. How are you going to be able to address with one-size-fits-all policy the European landscape, whereas you have different people and different constellations of groups in different countries supporting different policies? So I think this is something we need to be thinking about. On the question of populism, whether it's an ideology or whether it's strategy, I mean, I personally, in my work, align with the group that looks at it as a rhetorical style, and especially if you look at countries such as Greece, for example, all parties at many given points in the political history of the country since the 70s onwards are actually using it as a rhetorical tool. If it was just an ideology, you would find it hard to see how the entire party system might adopt such a rhetorical tool. So,
I think we have 1 minute left. Or
Yeah,
so.
1 minute.
So I'll take 30 seconds, leave you 30. So we certainly live in interesting times, but I also want to highlight the fact that there is a lot of pushback, a lot of mobilization to really protect and to protect liberal democracy. Slovakia elected a very liberal pro-European president, female, to run an anti-corruption platform. We see civil society mobilizing all over the place. And so, again, we should not be just focusing on the sort of negative aspect. We should also be seeing that there are civil society groups or political groups that really take this, fight very seriously. And I'm a domestic explanations person, so, there are some tectonic shifts, but I think ultimately it's more domestic politics. Strategy versus ideology, this is a very tough question. I would say follow the money. I think in the current research, really, because, Kasmood and other people, a lot of people really think about this as an ideology, but I think the strategic element of it is sometimes, not taken seriously. But I do think it matters. Policies do matter, and actions speak louder than words.
Okay. 30 seconds. So the key issue, at least for me, in the discussion on populism and Caesarian politics, is not that much about the style of discourse or electoral strategy as such, but it's about institutional change. So basically, the goal of Caesarian politics is to change institutions, to change structures, to make a re-election more likely. Right? So this is everything that is connected to that, that's adjacent, has consequences for that. Right? So it's not that much a style, or it could be, of course, there is a style as we call it a style, but actually the key issue is in how much populists are changing institutional structure to tune it more towards what political theory describes as tyranny of majority, rather than fully fledged democracy.
So as you can see, the discussion definitely is not exhausted and taken outside of these walls. For example,